Thanks for joining us on the program. I'm Chris Costello, and what a treat we have today. With us, we have Shawn Coyne, author of The Story Grid. Shawn Coyne is a 25-year book publishing veteran. He's worked at the top New York publishing houses, also has worked in independent publishing, recently as co-owner of Black Irish Press with best-selling author Stephen Pressfield. He's been a literary agent at major Hollywood talent agencies, and he's created the Story Grid, inspired from 25 years in the publishing industry. We're so pleased to have Shawn with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you've had a long and successful career as an editor working for the top 5 publishing houses, New York Publishing. What was that like?
It was a very, very heady experience. I started in publishing back in, I think it was around 1991, 1992. And back then, it was before the era of computers or ebooks or anything like that. So it was sort of growing up in the era of old school book publishing, which was a lot of fun, and it was very frightening at the same time. I worked at Dell Publishing for a few years, and Dell Publishing was a very large sort of mass market commercial publishing unit that would sort of stock those old dime store novels that you would find in your drugstore when you were growing up. Some of my favorite novels of all time would be published by Dell, and I had the honor of being able to work with an editor who edited Elmore Leonard, among many other people. So I had a great experience working with her, and her name was Jackie Farber. And then I moved on to St. Martin's Press, which is also one of the big 5 publishers now. And when I was at St. Martin's, I was tasked with sort of starting up a brand new paperback line of crime fiction, which was a wonderful experience for somebody. I was in my mid-20s at that point. So I really had to just jump right in and really cover the entire spectrum of crime fiction in a very short amount of time. And it was very intimidating, but a lot of fun, too. And then after St. Martin's Press, I went to Doubleday Publishing for about 6 years, and there I had a completely different job. My job at Doubleday was to sort of find those big, up-and-coming, best-selling novelists. So I wasn't tasked with doing a lot of books. I had to move from, say, publishing 80 to 100 books per year to 8. So when I did that, I had to find people like Robert Crace to publish, who's a fantastic crime writer, and I published also in nonfiction. I did a lot of work with sports and celebrity stuff. I did a book with Bill Murray, which was a lot of fun and a lot of stress. And then after that, I decided to start out on my own and to build my own publishing company, which was a whole other ball of wax.
Yeah, I like that. I like that fun and stress combined. How did you manage to do that?
The thing about anything that's challenging, and the thing about things that you love, is that if you're really stretching yourself, you're going to hit a wall, and you're going to feel a sense of panic. And it's been my experience that the more times you do that, you never get used to it, but at least you've been there before. So when I took on more challenging positions in book publishing, I found, oh my gosh, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make this next leap. But the thing that always stuck with me is, oh boy, you said that the last time. And so when you're constantly trying to push your limits and discover new ways of looking at the world and looking at your profession, you're never bored, and it's a lot of fun. But it's also stressful. So you kind of have to reach that point where you're comfortable in a little bit of stress and also enjoying the stress at the same time.
So you worked for the big 5 publishers in New York, and it seems like out of that came this phenomenal new book that you've just put out called The Story Grid. And I'm wondering how much of everything that you did over those 20, 25 plus years in editing are in that book.
It's pretty much everything. I'll tell you the genesis of the book, which is kind of a good story. When I was at Doubleday, one of the people I published was Stephen Pressfield. And Steve and I have grown to become very close friends, and we're business partners in Black Irish Books now. And one of the first books I did with Steve was a book that he wrote called Gates of Fire, which is a phenomenal book about the Battle of Thermopylae. It's a historical fiction. It's a very complicated story and yet very visceral at the same time. So one of the early drafts Steve had sent me, I let it slip that I said to him, don't worry about it, Steve. I'll just throw the grid on it, and I'll be able to get back to you in a couple of weeks. And he said, what are you talking about? What's this grid you're talking about? And what the grid is a method for looking at storytelling from a very analytical point of view, to look at stories and make it as practical as possible so that you're not worried about whether or not you're emotionally turning a reader's head at any one moment. Instead, you're learning about the nuts and bolts of what it takes to tell a story structurally. So it's sort of like the equivalent, like I always say, it's like a CT scan of, somebody who's going into the hospital, or, checking the blood work to see, how somebody's health is actually, going and doing. And it's so the story grid, what it does is it sort of takes the temperature and the health of the individual story, and it's something that I developed over a period of, working at the big five publishers and working independently and editing hundreds of books and reading about the fundamentals of storytelling, everybody from Aristotle and Plato to, Robert McKee and George Friedman and George Pulte and a whole slew of people who examine the fundamental story structure of storytelling. So it's based upon, thousands of years of smarter people than I sort of sussing out exactly how a story is well told, and then applying that to, how to tell a long-form story in fiction.
And it's fascinating to me just the way you've also got it so that it's so visually oriented. So you can really look at this and visualize a story and how to create it, how to organize it.
Yeah, that was a crucial thing for me as an editor in that, one of the things that I found I would often do is I would say to myself, I have to make a note of that the writer had accomplished a particular story point at a particular time. So in my head, I would say, I think that was around chapter 17 that Thomas Harris had, done a certain thing in The Silence of the Lambs. And, over time, I said to myself, wow, wouldn't it be great if I could just have a visual, sort of a graph that would show, exactly the movements of each of the scenes in the novel and the moments when, very, very large moments in the story happen. If I could track that and see it visually, then I wouldn't have to keep making all these notes in my head about one particular scene. I would just be able to look at something visual and say, that's where, the story moves from, desperation to all is lost moment. And so that's one of the things that I love about the story grid is it makes everything extremely visual. So something that's a very literal and wordy and difficult to, sort of explain in terms of writing, you can, when you see it visually, you say to yourself, okay, I get it now. That's the point of no return. That's when, the hero loses their faith in, their object of desire. I get it. So I love the visual element of it, and it's the thing that writers really respond to, because instead of me giving them a whole slew of notes, I can show them this graph, and they'll say, I see. I didn't do that thing. Now I know what I have to do to fix it.
Since you bring up the writer, Shawn, what are some of the most challenging things that have happened to you when working with writers as an editor?
One of the most challenging things when you're an editor is when you can see that the writer is tumbling down the vortex of sort of self, flagellation. And what I mean by that is that they have worked so hard and so diligently on a particular work, be it nonfiction or fiction, that they lose their ability to evaluate their work objectively. So if I say to them, hey, I think you need to fix this particular scene because it's not working, or you're not proving that particular point that you brought up at the very start of your essay, instead of them saying, oh, okay, that's a sort of like a faulty shower in my bathroom that I need to repair, and it's a very practical way of, you know how to repair a shower. Instead of doing that, they say, oh, I am the worst writer ever. I'm never going to be able to be successful. This is just further proof of my inability to learn anything. I'm terrible, blah, blah, blah. And they can't get out of it. And no matter how hard I try to explain to them, hey, you're not the problem. You're the genius who actually had the time and the temerity and put forth the effort to create this amazing work. Now, you've got the work here. You've done that. You're a genius. Now figure out what you need to do to fix it and take yourself out of the equation. Look at it like you're building a house. No carpenter and no architect and nobody in any building art would say to themselves, oh, I'm a terrible carpenter because I made a bad right angle. No, what they do is they take out the piece that they made a mistake on and they fix it. And that's exactly what the writer needs to sort of say to themselves repeatedly. They're not the problem. The problems are the problem. So just find your problems and make a list of your problems and go step by step and fix them. And take yourself and your vanity and your ego and all that stuff and just put it aside. So if I had to pinpoint the one thing that writers notoriously do, it's they self-sabotage. And as an editor, I can tell them what the problems are. I can be a cheerleader, but I can't be the one to fix their book for them. They actually have to do that themselves.
I noticed, after so many years of interviewing best-selling writers, I can now look at a book and kind of almost immediately get a feel for, does this work?
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me, like how many writers that you work with, when you actually give them that feedback, are able to take that feedback and run with it, or how many what's your feel for that? What's that been like for you?
That's a really good point, Chris, because as I was just saying, the problem is that they let their egos, sort of run rampant, and once a writer reaches a certain level of commercial success, the publishing company that publishes that writer demands less and less of them editorially, and that's unfortunate, but it makes sense too. It's sort of like if you found somebody who's created something that's extremely popular, and the next book, you're pretty much guaranteed that the same audience is going to come to that book expecting the same thing, and if they don't get exactly what they want, but it's close, they'll still buy it and they're not going to complain. So what happens is that you find these very, very successful writers who, on their 7th, 8th, 9th book, they start to sort of check out. And if somebody says to them, and this happened in my career with a number of best-selling writers that I worked with, and if somebody says to them, I really think you need to pump up that, climax in your third act, they'll look at me and say, oh, well, when did you become, when have you sold 17 million copies of a book?
Right.
And, I can't argue with that. And if I didn't have the backup of the publisher behind me saying, if you don't fix that, we're going to have trouble publishing your book. And that's rarely going to happen because it's a business first and foremost. And, if you could publish a blank book and sell 1 million copies, you would as a major publisher because they're corporations, right? So that was one of the things that kind of, that was an indication. The tea leaves were saying to me back in, the late 1990s, big publishing is fantastic and everything, and there's a lot of sort of ego gratification about being a big editor at a big publishing house. But when those kinds of things started to happen more and more often to me, that's when I said to myself, you really should find a different route of, doing what you love without having to sort of placate egos and not say what you think and temper your behavior and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Well, you answered my next question, which was why Black Irish Press?
Oh, well, that's a funny story too. After I left big publishing, I did have an independent company myself for about 7 years called Rugged Land Books, which had a lot of successes, but it was also faced with sort of like the culture of Big Five publishing, which this was pre-ebook too. So I was about 10 years ahead of my time, and the stress level of Rugged Land really took it out of me until the point where I just said, I think it's time for me to try something new. And that's when I started working again really intensely with Stephen Pressfield again. And together, when I was at Rugged Land, I published The War of Art, which is Steve's classic book about resistance and sort of creating things as artists. So after, I think this is around 2005 or so, or 2007, Steve and I started working closer and closer together. And at one point, The War of Art had come up for renewal in paperback. So I said to Steve, Steve, just for fun, we should just not renew the paperback license with Hachette and publish it ourselves. And he was like, yeah, why not? Let's do it for a lark. And then he said, well, we need to have a name for this publishing company. And I was like, oh, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then Steve came up with the name Black Irish Books, which I think is fantastic. And the etymology of it is that I have a tendency when I would go into the major publishers with Steve at marketing meetings to sort of not lose my cool, but sort of get a little bit frustrated and show a little bit of my Black Irish kind of anger. So I thought it was really funny when he said, we should call it Black Irish Books and we'll have a boxing glove as our logo. And I thought, hey, you can't really argue with that.
At Wellness Talk Radio, we'd like to invite you to come check out our website at wellnesstalkradio.com. I want to hear a little more about, since you've had so much experience working with authors over the years, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see beginning authors make?
Well, here's the big problem with beginning writers, and it's a sensitive subject because for whatever reason I don't know, but a lot of people think that they can just write a novel, on a lark. And there's a funny story about Margaret Atwood, who was, I think she was at a writers' conference, and a really talented neurosurgeon had come up to her, and he was saying to her, you're such a masterful writer, and wow, I admire your work so much, and I'm a neuroscientist, and I've been working, and I'm going to retire in about 5 years, and I'm thinking I'm going to write a novel after I retire. And what do you think about that? And Margaret Atwood said to him, well, I think that's a really, really great idea. In fact, can I ask your advice? Because I'm thinking of stopping writing after my next novel, and I'm thinking of becoming a neuroscientist. How would I do that? And I think that is the attitude a lot of people have about writing, is that it's sort of this creative, you're being touched by the gods and given stories in your brain that you can just sort of bang out on a typewriter or, a computer. Listen to how old I am, typewriter. But the fact is you have to study. You have to read. You have to understand story structure and the fundamentals of storytelling in exactly the same way that a neuroscientist has to learn about neurons and, neurotransmitters and, the biology, all that stuff. So it's a very similar, there's a discipline to writing that's not very romantic. It's hard work. It's like learning to be a master bricklayer or any of the great arts of, working with your hands. You get nicked up a lot. You get hurt. It's painful. You spend a lot of time alone. And a lot of amateur writers don't really want to hear about that, and they just want you to give them the toolbox and the secrets and let them go and build something, from scratch. And the way amateur writers can get better and better and better, you know what they have to do? They have to read. They have to read and read and read and read in the genres that they're most interested in. So if you want to write a novel like Stephen King, you better read all of Stephen King, right? Why not learn from the master himself? Because he's giving you a beautiful lesson, book after book after book. And, if you want to be a terrific narrative nonfiction writer, why not read Eric Larson or, John Krakauer, or the wonderful woman who wrote Seabiscuit, Laura Hillebrand, who also wrote Unbroken. Those are the things that I would recommend to people who want to be writers. Hey, it's totally cool to want to be a writer, and I'm not knocking the neurosurgeon who wants to. And he can very well learn the art, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000-hour rule for writing, as just as it is for anything else.
And they might want to read the story grid. I'm so glad that it came my way because, I've always thought I might want to be a writer, and I certainly have written a lot over the years. But, boy, I got that book and I went, Chris, you've got a lot more studying to do.
Well, you can make it fun. Well, I think that would be the one thing that would make me the happiest, if it would just sort of, ground people and let them know, hey, anybody can become a writer. Anybody who applies themselves and does the amount of work necessary can be, a very fine writer. Will they be, unforgotten for the rest of time? Who knows? But it's a craft. It's like I compare it to bricklaying. I compare it to carpentry because it requires that kind of discipline.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if you love to lay bricks, and if you love to build things, and if you love to write, it's going to be a joy. It's going to be stressful and painful and irritating too, but the joys will always outweigh the labor. The labor is really where you need to get your sustenance, not the results of the labor.
And what a gift this would be to have this as the first text in any high school, college creative writing class. Because, boy, I tell you, 30 years ago when I was doing that whole thing, that would have changed many things.
That's one of the reasons why I wrote it, Chris, because, as you asked at the very beginning, when I started in book publishing, there was no class I could take to learn how to edit. There was no text. There was nothing that taught me how to discern whether a story worked or didn't work, or how to help somebody who was having trouble, or how to, fix something, or how to make something even better. And so I had to learn it all myself, and I spent a lot of time doing it because it's my love, it's what I love to do. I'm not complaining that I had to work hard because I enjoyed it. But, when I was back when I told Steve about the story grid, he said, you know what, you need to write this book because there's nothing like it out there. There's no editing course that any person can take. And unfortunately, if you go to an MFA writing program across the country, the process is basically you write something, you hand it to 15 of your colleagues and a teacher, and then the next week, everybody rips it to shreds and makes you feel terrible without giving you any practical advice about how to make your work better. And I think there's a big, big problem with that.
Right.
And one of the reasons why, they don't do anything else is there isn't really a methodology to teach people how to do this kind of stuff. Now, I'll be the first one to say I don't have the talent of a Jonathan Franzen. Jonathan Franzen knows the material in the story grid as well as I do, probably better. But I would also say that I think I probably would be able to communicate the story grid material better than Jonathan Franzen. So imagine a situation where you had a teacher who's an amazing writer like Jonathan Franzen with a tool like the story grid. I think that would be a really unbeatable combination because it combines the analytical and the creative and gives equal weight. Right now, the weight is too much on the ethereal, muses descending upon you, and you write a masterpiece.
That is interesting how it's somewhat specific to the writing career. I mean, that certainly doesn't happen in the visual arts. No one would expect you to be able to put together a video and edit it without lots of training, things like that.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking. A lot of people always ask me, it's usually business people will ask me questions like, what problem did you write the story grid to solve? And I always think that's a pretty interesting question because they're looking at it from the point of view of marketing and advertising. Like if we had to make an ad, what problem would we say that people had that the story grid will solve? And the problem is how to make your writing better without destroying yourself. It's the practical knowledge that is not, it's very, very easy to understand. And applying the knowledge is difficult, but the knowledge itself it's fundamental math, and it's fundamental, language. It's not difficult to understand the concepts of storytelling, and applying those concepts isn't difficult either. It's just knowing, the arena, knowing the things that are necessary, and then going and accomplishing those goals.
Obviously you changed hats from going from editor to author for the Story Grid. I want to ask you, Shawn, what surprised you the most when you were writing the Story Grid? I really enjoyed. I did read the part where you mentioned on a lark that you would write this to Stephen Pressfield, and went on from there. What surprised you the most?
The thing that is so surprising about writing is that you think you know where you're going when you begin. And I am one of those people who like to have a roadmap. I like to plan incessantly. I like to give myself checklists of things to do every day. And so when I started to write this, I thought, I know exactly how I'm going to write this. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to chart out 40 chapters. My first 10 chapters are going to kind of hook the reader into wanting to read more. My next 20 chapters are going to build up the meat and potatoes of my methodology. And then the last 10 chapters are sort of going to be the big payoff. I'm going to give them, an example of exactly how this thing is going to work. And generally that's the way the book works. But to get to that place required a lot of sturm and drang and personal sort of deep thinking that I didn't anticipate. So the great thing about writing in and of itself is that when you start a writing project, be it a blog post or a letter to a friend or just writing a recipe down to make pound cake, you think you know where you're going, and you do generally. But the process of taking what's inside your head and through your body into, I know this is sounding kind of cheesy, but the process of taking what's in your head through your body to your fingertips onto a keyboard and then seeing what comes out, it really changes and affects. It's as if, that process is changing the way you see the world. So when I started out to write the Story Grid, I thought, this is going to be very easy. I know I'll do 500 words a day, and I'll knock this thing out in 6 months. And I got to confess, I have written things like that before, and they've worked fine as a ghostwriter. But because this was a personal journey for me, it's sort of like the culmination of everything I've learned over 20X years. It didn't work out that way. I'd start somewhere, and then I would go somewhere else, and then I would discover a new thing that I hadn't thought about. And then I had to put that back into my methodology and figure out if that could make sense. And then when that did work, that would bring up another element. So by the time this was over, it took me, a good 3.5 years. The Story Grid, which was a fundamental tool that I'd been using for 20 years, had become very, very precise. And I'm still, kind of in awe of the end result myself, because if you look at sort of one of my very first blog posts on storygrid.com, I show, the reader the Story Grid. I showed Stephen Pressfield that I had done, which was sort of like a sine cosine thing. It was a chicken scratchy thing that was kind of interesting. I think it's pretty neat. But by the time I finished, and you look at the final Story Grid at the end of the book, you'll see, oh my gosh, that is completely different. It's thematically the same, but it's a completely different, more precise instrument. So the great thing about writing is that it's a process of self-discovery that is that thing. It is that ethereal thing that a lot of people, that romantic thing that people love. But you need to learn your craft before that kind of stuff will come to you. I hope that kind of answers it.
Yeah, and one thing, Shawn, I don't want to scare people here as far as you do talk a lot about two different hats, and you don't start out just editing when you're writing, because I think people could look at the book, The Story Grid, and maybe get that impression.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is really, really true. The important thing to take away, and Steve Pressfield, again, has a great method, and Steve's a hugely successful international best-selling writer. And what he does, and his take on the story grid is exactly what I would recommend to anyone. And so, I was inspired to sort of take this concept of his called the foolscap method, which is a one-page outline. Just one piece of paper, and you basically divide it into three sections, and you have your beginning, your middle, and your end. And you answer a bunch of questions. This is before you begin your project. You answer a bunch of fundamental questions, 6 questions I cover in the story grid, and you just write them on that piece of paper. And then you take a deep breath, you walk around the block, you turn off that guy who's answering the deep questions, and you go into your writing room, and you say to yourself, I've got a beginning, middle, and end here. I'm going to write my first draft. And I know where I'm going to finish with this ending. I know the middle, and I know the beginning. So now my job is to do a first draft. And I am going to flat out write and take whatever the world gives me in my brain with that guide. But I'm not going to edit myself. I'm not going to change my sentences. I'm not going to, go back and rewrite what I wrote yesterday. The goal of the writing at the beginning is to get a draft. And the draft is whatever it ends up being. It could be 30,000 words. It could be 80,000 words. It could be, if it's a shorter book, it could be 10,000. It could be whatever it is your goal is. If your goal is to write a mystery novel, you should know how long a usual mystery novel is, which is about 60 to 80,000 words. Then your goal for that first draft would be to write 60 to 80,000 words. Once you have that first draft, then you go to the story grid. Now, the story grid will help you inspire that one-page sort of foolscap, list of things you need to get done for your first draft. But you shouldn't really kill yourself over the story grid until you have a draft. And then you can use the principles in the story grid to analyze the draft and make it much better. You can take it from a C- to a B and then to a B+, and depending on how many drafts you go through it. But it's important to remember the first draft is the beginning. That is really your start point. And editing is where, you really, anybody who follows feature films or movies knows that shooting 150,000 feet of film, that's the raw material that they give to the editor in the editing room, and he makes the story out of it. And that's the way you should look at writing, too.
And Shawn, you've been at the top New York publishing houses, now co-owner of Black Irish Press. What's the number one bit of advice that you would give to writers?
Know why you're in it. If you're in it to sort of get some sort of ego satisfaction and third-party validation by being published by a major publishing house, that's okay. At least understand that's what you want. And if that's what you want, then take the steps necessary to get what you want. But the other thing I'm going to say about that is that I used to think, and a lot of people have asked me, why didn't you just take the story grid to, Little Brown or, Random House and have them publish it? Because if you did, they'd probably put it on the New York Times bestseller list. They're really a good, powerful, and, that's a very big possibility that could have happened. But the reason why I didn't do that was there's something really to the notion that to give away the information that you've accumulated in your life and your career and in your life's work, and to give it away to people who are desperate for that information in a crystal clear, easy to understand, and reasonable manner is more important than to try and sell 5,000 copies in the first week on sale so that you can make the New York Times bestseller list, so that I can tell the checkout lady at the grocery store that I'm a New York Times bestselling author. Because you know what? That means nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I can say, when I was an editor and as a publisher, I've had tons of books that were New York Times bestsellers, hundreds of millions of copies of stuff that I've been involved with have sold. But I get far more satisfaction when somebody says, "Hey, you really helped me fix, the sticking point I had in my midpoint in my book from that post that you wrote." That's far more satisfying to me than a book that I worked on that was on the New York Times bestseller list for 13 weeks. But I got to say, you probably need to get on the bestseller list at some point if that's just to make you feel like you've been there. But anyway, my single advice is know why you're in it. If you're in it to serve yourself, okay, that's reasonable. Do what's necessary to get whatever it is that you need from that experience. But, in the long run, if you serve other people and you give them the fruits of your knowledge from your career or your life, and you do it in a way that's respectful and not exploiting them, that's going to make you feel much more secure and happy. And the flip side to that is you're going to find financial, stability that way, just probably better financial stability than you would by, selling your stuff to big publishers.
Right, and I'm hoping the Story Grid becomes a textbook and you can save all of those new writers. So
from your lips to God's ears, Chris.
Shawn, I also want to ask you, since you've been in this book world for a while now, what would you most want people to know about the book world now? I know it's changing a lot now. It's a really interesting place now.
It is. The thing to remember about major book publishing right now, and this is a crucial element, and it's something that they still sort of have not quite figured out, is that the major book publishing companies right now, they're in the business of hits. They're sort of in the Hollywood studio model of trying to get the $1 billion box office sensation. So that's what they call front list in book publishing. Now, front list book publishing is really exciting if you're chosen to be part of that sort of arena. But very few people are chosen for that. And, even if you are, chances are in the long run, you may not have a career. Book publishing used to have, it's become a derogatory term now, but it used to be like, they used to call it the mid-list or genre publishing. And that's where I started out as an editor. And, I rose to the point where I was in the business of doing the big book and finding those big hits when I moved from, sort of St. Martin's Press, Dell Publishing, St. Martin's Press, all the way to AA. But what was really fun and the most exciting for me was when I was in the mid-list genre business. And what that was is when they would publish a lot of writers in individual genres to see and test the market to see if they could find and build an audience for a particular writer. And with some of the great writers that we have out today, like Michael Connelly and Robert Crace and James Lee Burke, and I've had the pleasure to work with those guys over the years, they started there. They started, like Robert Crace's first book was called The Monkey's Raincoat. It was a paperback original published by Bantam Press in, 1989. The first print run was probably 5,000 paperback copies. And it won the Edgar Award for Best Original Paperback Mystery. And then he wrote another one, and that one sold maybe 6,000 copies, and on and on and on. And now Crace is the #1 New York Times bestseller. But it took him a good 10 books before he reached that pinnacle. Now the major publishers want you to be on the bestseller list on your first novel. And even if you make it, and I've had writers make it in their first novel, if their second novel doesn't do better, or if they fall off the list, the publisher's kind of like, well, thank you, but you're too expensive now, and we'd like to give somebody else a chance, so good luck to you. So where does that leave, the big writer at that point? It leaves them in actually a place that's pretty great, which is finding your own audience and publishing to your own fans and finding your fans and communicating with them in a way that is respectful and giving. So when, the story grid was coming together, I said to myself, look, I can either try and jam this book out and, tempt everybody with little snippets of it from now until eternity and hope that they'll buy it, or I can just give it away. Because the big thing, Chris, today is it's not getting people to buy your book so much it is to get them to read it, to get them to actually spend the time and the emotional energy necessary to get through a book is a big commitment today. And be respectful of that commitment. So when I started the Story Grid, website, I said to myself, I'm going to give this away. Because if people are enjoying it and they like it, they're going to recommend it to somebody else. And the thing is about Story Grid and about theory and methodology is that it's always nice to have the finished product anyway. And if they really like it and it's good enough, maybe they'll buy the ebook. And if they like the ebook, they might buy the paperback. Who knows? But the first step is to engage people in a way that keeps them, motivated and interested in what you have to say.
And Story Grid, it's one of those books I can tell, and I have lots of books here, obviously, but it is one of those books where you need the hard copy of it, and you need it up on the shelf. It's just it's funny that way. I can see that already with that book. It's very interesting.
Oh, good. Anyway, so I think big publishing and electronic publishing and independent publishing today are two different worlds. They're both valid. But you should just really choose which one you want, and you really need to make a commitment to either one.
The era of the gatekeepers is swiftly going away, and there's so many opportunities to reach your audience directly now. So, Shawn, I've heard rumor that you may be doing a conference. Is that true, in L.A. or New York?
Well, the thing is that Steve and I have been approached by conference organizers a number of times, and we've always said, no, it's just not something that we would want to do. And we have considered doing something, but we haven't figured out what that would be. And if we do something, it's not going to be like your standard kind of conference. And so I'm not even sure we're going to do it right now. It gives me great hesitation. And I know it does Steve, too. But there is nothing really as strong as a personal connection, one-on-one, everybody in the flesh in a room. The trick is to be able to satisfy what people want out of that experience without feeling like, I'm sort of like a master of ceremonies, in a circus. If that makes any sense.
Right, but I think just being able to ask you questions would be a great start.
Well, maybe we should just have a Q&A day, and then people can come, and we'll film it and give it away. I don't know. That's not a bad idea.
I like that idea. All right. Well, Shawn, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Wellness Talk Radio, and just enjoyed the Story Grid so much. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Last week I learned a lot and had a lot of fun participating in a course on Quistic. That's QUISTIC.com if you want to look it up. I learned a lot. The course was on personality types. This one they were talking about the ENFP, and pretty close to that, and explained to me why I've always been a big idea kind of person. The courses are taught by Penelope Trunk. She's a blogger, and a very interesting blog that she has. And I was really excited to participate in it. Penelope gave me access, and I really learned a lot. So it was a fun course, and it's 4 sessions, and I got a lot out of it. I want to encourage you to check it out. It's Quistic, QUISTIC.com. And we'll be sharing parts of the course on the radio here every week, so we hope you enjoy it and that you get a lot out of it too.
What should NFPs do for work? And also that your outline, I think probably on the site, said that you were going to mention the thing that ENFPs do best, e.g. better than all other types. And what is that in the work world?
So what the ENFPs do better than anybody else is inspire people to see possibility. So some people want to see those and some people don't. It's too much for some people. But nobody can inspire other people to see possibilities like you guys can. So it's not just giving a list of possibilities, it's seeing things that other people can't see because you don't need to live in concrete reality. And then it's bringing that vision to everybody else in a way that's meaningful to them personally. So you mobilize people through your ability to see possibility. And where you should be is in a place where you can get people to see those possibilities, where you bring the possibilities to the table and you help other people to see them. Nobody can do that as well as you. So I'm just going to give one little example of a great ENFP job, because any ENFP that has a great career has an incredible career. They don't just have like okay career, because an ENFP doesn't stay in anything long enough unless it's really awesome.
Thanks for joining us on Wellness Talk Radio. I'm Chris Costello, and today we are talking with Molly Morgan, author of Drink Your Way to Gut Health, 140 delicious probiotic smoothies and other drinks that cleanse and heal. So now you've researched the effect of probiotics on stomach and digestive health for years, right?
Well, yeah, as a registered dietitian, gut health is always something that, you need to keep at the forefront of when you're looking at someone's overall health, because as we continue to learn through emerging research, there's so many connections to our overall health and the health of our gut.
There's so many books right now out about how important it is and what a huge role your digestive system plays in keeping healthy or recovering from really serious illness even.
And you know what, I think sometimes traditional medicine takes a while to have these things kind of concretely work into practice, if you will. I know even sometimes with registered dietitians, it might be an area, I've been a dietitian for 15 years, and we certainly know more about gut health today than we did when I was in school 15 years ago. So also depending on your area of focus and what you practice, but it is amazing the science that's coming out on this topic and just how important having not only probiotics but also a diversity of these healthy bacteria in our intestines really seems to be linked, again, to overall health, but also I think fascinating, seems to have an impact possibly on our weight as well.
So what kind of issues have you seen people reverse successfully with focusing on using probiotics and smoothies to heal?
You know what I've seen with people working in these probiotics and smoothies is really one of the things that stands out the most is this enhanced immune system. A lot of times, life bogs us down, either travel schedules or work schedules, or I work with a lot of professional athletes who have very demanding schedules. And I really see when people can focus on incorporating probiotics, it's just kind of not the best pun in the world, but icing on the cake. So not only the saying is true, you are what you eat, but it's also you are what your intestines can absorb. And by having probiotics in our intestines, they need to be there, and they really do help our bodies utilize all the great foods we're taking in.
You talk about the immune-boosting recipes. There's drinks that can help you energize, help you detox, help you refuel, get thinner. Refueling smoothies that you talk about that look really good.
Yeah, and refueling is so important. And I talk about in the book, again, I work with a lot of professional athletes. And the right mix of nutrients after a workout is so important. It helps your body heal and replenish your tired muscles. You need a blend of carbs and protein. One of my favorites is it's an almond butter and jelly smoothie. It's just 1 cup of frozen mixed berries, a half cup of almond milk, a half cup of plain Greek yogurt, 2 tablespoons of almond butter, and, optionally you can add in a little bit of agave nectar. You whip it together, and I'll tell you, it's so creamy and smooth, and the berries plus the yogurt and the almond butter, It's really a wonderful way to refuel those tired muscles.
Sometimes people are concerned about too much sugar in smoothies and things like that. How do they do this so they're not getting too much sugar when they're doing a smoothie kind of meal?
Well, one thing I'd like to tell most people is a big tip is to always start with plain yogurt or plain kind of base ingredients. Because as soon as you start with flavored yogurt or kefir, for example, there's already added sugars to those products. So if you can always start with plain, you're kind of in control, if you will, of your sugar quantity then. And then always taste your smoothie. And I list optional in a lot of the smoothies around the sugar content because really, less is better, no doubt about it. So if you can skip the sugar that's added to the smoothie and that tastes great to you, I think that's a wonderful way to go. And then just sweeten it back a little bit if you need to, and just, start small. A half teaspoon, a teaspoon at the most is usually all you need.
One of the other things that you talk about are the fermented foods and how important those are. And I know it's really popular to have recipes and things for making this yourself. Is that difficult? I mean, I worry that I would create some kind of science experiment. I've looked at these cabbage recipes and kind of went, okay.
Well, the awesome part about it is a bit like a science experiment. I mean, the fermentation is happening almost before your eyes. Like, I love making ginger beer, and, you make it, and then it sits for, a day to 2 days, and then you can start to see the bubbling happening. And it's so fascinating, I think, number one. And that's probably the dietitian in me. But I talk a lot about food safety in the kind of intro to the book, because if you are going to prepare these fermented foods at home, kind of as you said, Chris, it's so important. You've got to use good sanitation practices. You've got to have sterile containers and wash your hands. And although we're talking about bacteria, we want to focus on the right type of bacteria and not things that could possibly harm us. But I think it's certainly worth a try. I make my own kombucha tea, my own yogurt, my own kefir on a routine basis. And once you get the hang of it, it's really not that hard. It's a little time consuming, but you can save a bundle of money too.
Yeah, and so Molly, how did you get into this? It sounds like you've been doing this for a while, and I'm just curious how this came about for you.
Well, how I got into this is actually my third book, and one of the things I'm very, very passionate about is that helping people work healthy eating into their routine. I don't believe in a particular diet. I believe healthy eating is really about day in and day out making the best choices you can with your foods and beverages. And so I think probiotics is an area that people need a lot of help with, particularly is what was the motivation for this book. Even I myself found that, okay, I know what kombucha tea is, but how do I incorporate this into my routine, and how can I help other people, with simple recipes? Most of the recipes in this book have, on average, probably 5 ingredients. They're not complex, and I think that's important too. Healthy eating doesn't have to be complicated. Simple ingredients, great flavor, and they're quite beautiful as well, all these fruit and vegetable-based smoothies.
Molly, where can people find you if they want to find out more?
Sure. I'm online, of course, at mollymorganrd.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Molly. And finally, today we have a minute with news anchor Dan Harris talking with us about meditation. What do you do if your mind keeps wandering? What is the least amount of time that I can sit and meditate and still get the benefits that scientists talk about?
The scientists haven't come up with the minimum dosage. It's a funny term when you're thinking about meditation, but that's the term they use. We don't know what the minimum dosage is to get all of the health benefits that we believe are associated with meditation, which include, lowering your blood pressure and boosting your immune system and changing key parts of the brain that have to do with stress and compassion. But, I've asked around a lot, and the sense that I get from teachers and scientists is that it's okay for me to recommend that people start with 5 minutes a day. And what I say to people is that you should start with 5 minutes a day and tell yourself you're never going to do more. Because what I don't want is for people to add meditation to their to-do list and have it become one more thing that's stressing them out. That defeats the whole purpose. And many people may feel that they're too busy to meditate, but 5 minutes a day is doable for anybody, no matter how busy you are.
At Wellness Talk Radio, we'd like to invite you to come check out our website at wellnesstalkradio.com. Hope you have a great week.